Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hybrid Cloud Do's and Don'ts Summit. Today's event was organized by the hardworking folks at Virtualization and Cloud Review who have left no stone unturned in their efforts to bring together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsor, Rubrik, the Zero Trust data management company, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of Application Development Trends, and I'll be your moderator for the first of 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, I need to go over a few housekeeping details. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsor, Rubrik, has provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. As you leave the summit today, you'll be asked to take a very short survey. Please take a moment to share your honest opinions. Our editors read every comment, and they do help to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a Surface Pro 7, Microsoft's ultralight tablet featuring a laptop-class Intel Core processor, all-day battery, and HD cameras. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session, Hybrid Clouds, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. For this session, we've called on John O'Neill, Sr., Chief Technologist at AWS Solutions. John has worked in IT for more than 20 years in roles ranging from software architect to senior executive, consultant to author. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects. He's developed technology training courseware for Pluralsight and authored material for both Thomas Reuters' Aspetor books and Exec Blueprints. John is a sought-after speaker who has taken the stage at such events as Tech Mentor, Cloud and Virtualization Live 360, and the Northeast Ohio Technology Summit. He's a multi-year Microsoft MVP and the recipient of the Northeast Ohio Software Association CIO of the Year Award. I know you're in for a great session. Take it away, John.
Thank you so very much, John. And that Northeast Ohio Software Association is a tongue twister. So I appreciate you throwing that one out there. So, everyone, today I am really excited to be here with each of you and to have a discussion on the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to our hybrid clouds, our mixed environments. So let's jump right into it. And we're going to go through. Please put your questions in the Q&A. As John said, I'm going to try and leave as much time at the end to answer your questions as possible. And we'll share as much of our experiences and knowledge as we can. So with that, I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about, what we've grown up with, where we come from. And that is the traditional 3-tiered infrastructure. We have our compute or our CPU, RAM, our processing capability. Then we have our storage where we, store all of that important data. And finally, we have the networking infrastructure that allows us to share that data, the compute power or whatnot across our network to our users. Because at the end of the day, if it's sitting isolated, it's not adding much value to the organization. So when we talk about moving into a private cloud, it's important to first off acknowledge that a private cloud isn't just another word for what we've always done. It is a very unique way or specific way of taking what we've always done and re-architecting it to better align with the businesses and organizations that exist today in 2021. Right? That standard 3-tier model has been around for decades upon decades, and that doesn't necessarily make it well aligned to give your organization or my business or anything else, educational, government, whatever. It doesn't necessarily aligned to give them the most impact, the most value. So private cloud architectures are targeted at doing pretty much just that. They allow us to take those traditional 3 tiers and spin them around, move them around, align them so that we can accomplish current 2021 era demands, right? And the elephant in the room right now, as far as demands for an organization go, are, how does my organization leverage IT, IT resources and systems to remain top of their game, competitive in all scenarios in the midst of a global pandemic, right? Because at the end of the day, the P&L doesn't really care whether a pandemic is going on or not. So we have to deliver architectures that keep us competitive and moving forward. And one of the big parts of that right now is security, right? We're dealing with security threats that are now nation state sponsored. That's pretty new and unique compared to what we've grown up with in cybersecurity, because it changes the level of attacks that we're seeing coming at us. I mean, it's hard to imagine. We come from an environment where, people were targeting us, where, kids in their basement, if anybody remembers the old War Games movie, that kind of thing, or, just organized crime wanting some money or whatever. And now we're talking about literal countries applying all their resources to attack us or accomplish some end. So that's a whole different security concept going on there. We also have the need in this global remote work era to evolve our systems and create them with a structure that allows us to segregate and separate certain things based upon our organizational boundaries, our departments, whether we have, remote workers using VPN technologies or just web technologies, any of that kind of thing. So that's important. And we also have the need to minimize cost. And that's always been a need, right? Nobody's ever said, hey, just spend what you want, at least not in my experience. Maybe some of you out there have had that. And if you do, please give me a call and let me know, because I would love to experience that one. Hey, spend whatever you want. It'll all work out. But that shared infrastructure allows us to lower those costs. So these are reasons why we want to use that new private cloud type architecture. And so let's talk a little bit more specifically now. We talked generally about why public clouds, but let's talk specifically about some of the features that you get there, right? Is that when we compare public clouds to private clouds, our why for the public clouds are things like instantly available capacity. So all of a sudden, the pandemic hit and we had to support a bunch of our workforce remotely, and our organization was never designed for a remote work scenario. Well, how do you do that? You don't go out and buy a bunch of equipment and cable up a bunch of new switches and everything else, because you don't have the time to do that. Maybe you don't have the money to do that. But using a public cloud like AWS or Microsoft Azure, you're able to quickly go in there and spin up new servers, things like WVD, Windows Virtual Desktop technologies, right? Using Azure VPN and firewalls and all those kind of things. You can quickly go in and do all these things and make them available to that newly remote workforce and deliver that IT value. It's instantly available. And then once you have them available, you can easily scale them up or scale them down and only pay for what you're using as you're using it, right? That's a big challenge. Say we took that approach of, well, we're going to have a bunch of remote workers, so let's go buy VPN concentrators and extra servers and increase storage and networks to attach everything, and we make that investment. And then for whatever reason, the demand for that remote workforce drops, so we now only have 50% of the users, well, we've already spent that money on that capital, so it's gone. Whereas with a public cloud resource, we can just scale it back, and then going forward, we would only pay basically for 50% of what we had been paying for. And then, machine learning. This is one that I don't hear a lot in my travels, but I bring up a lot. And the reason for it is because the machine learning that is being built into all these public clouds is amazing. Things like Azure Sentinel that leverage machine learning, and things like, to stay in the Azure ecosystem, things like Power BI, or even the Azure Microsoft 365 security suite. All those things are leveraging this artificial intelligence engine that is being built out to give you copious amounts of data and results that you just wouldn't be able to accomplish in a private cloud, because no one has the resources or time to do it that public clouds do when they do it at scale. Partner integration. We all have partners as part of our scheme for success, part of our strategy, if you will. There's no one that I'm aware of that provides everything holistically within their own environment. They may buy a specific brand of hardware, or they operate on a specific set of software. Maybe you're in commercial business and you use an enterprise resource planning package, and you use SAP, or you use Microsoft Dynamics, Sage 500, whatever it may be, but you're using these specific things. And so the partnerships you establish are critical. Well, depending on the size of your organization, the complexity, what you're trying to deliver, it can be a long process to convince those partners to integrate with your private cloud infrastructure. But public clouds, they have gone through the effort of integrating with Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure and Google Cloud and all those things, because they know that integration is going to impact many of their customers. So a great example that just pops up in my mind is Kronos, or UKG now under their new name. So one of the most popular HR management systems in the US. And that system, one of the big things is all the employees of a company usually want to be able to log in there, look at their pay stubs, maybe enter their time, maybe supervisors are approving time, whatever. But it involves a login. It involves identity management and, AAA for authorization, accounting, that sort of thing. Well, if you had to set up each and every one of those users when they onboard and then take them out when they offboard, plus you're doing that in that Active Directory, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So UKG has gone and created an integration with Azure, with AWS, with these things that you can just click through, and there's plenty of documentation to tell you how to set it up. Another thing that you don't really get when you try and do it in a private cloud environment, and you just are in very short order able to take advantage of single sign-on and use your already created Active Directory or other identity management-based accounts to authenticate into that system. And that's just one example. Of course, since I started out kind of with where we come from with that 3-tier infrastructure, I want to kind of talk about the major 3 silos, if you will, although they cross to one another, of cloud services. And the first that I have listed there is software as a service, right? And this is where that application, like since I was speaking of Kronos, they have a workforce ready application that they deliver as a service. So you're not installing any software on your private servers, your in-house data center, any of that kind of stuff. It's all served to you from the cloud. Then you also have platform as a service, where you're offering things as an entire platform, but consuming them and able to scale up and scale down as necessary. So think of the ability to offer up whole desktops through Windows Virtual Desktop or whole servers in the cloud, that kind of thing. You're able to get the entire platform and then anything that runs on that platform as a service. And finally, infrastructure as a service. As I mentioned, all the major cloud providers, public cloud providers, have the ability to offer you cloud-based firewalling and intrusion prevention, data loss prevention, and VPN technology, both for site-to-site and client-to-site. All those things are available to you. So those are important to take advantage of. And the final one is security. And you'll notice there's a theme going throughout here where I talk about security, because one of the first things that I do when I meet with folks and I have a conversation is I ask them how many think that they're in IT security. And I ask this: if it's a group of developers, a group of database administrators, group of network administrators, I don't care. I ask the same question, and there's a reason for that. And I'll get to that in a second. But some small amount will usually raise their hand. Sometimes I get no hands. Sometimes I get a whole bunch of hands. But the answer that I give them all, or the response I give them all, is exactly the same. Everyone should put their hand up. In 2021 and going forward, as far as I can see, anyone who has any function in IT is an IT security specialist also, because their job will involve thinking about and designing around and accommodating the best practices to keep your organization and its data and its systems secure. You can't just say, well, I'm going to fire up a SQL server and I'm going to use local authentication and I'm going to use the default SA account and all that, and look, I've got a SQL database and everything else. Because if you do that, and then any of the number of threats that are out there are able to come in and take advantage of it because, for instance, you left that SA account enabled, your organization is going to take a hard look at you and simply looking back and saying, well, I'm the database guy, not the security guy. That usually won't get those C-suite executives feeling empathy, right? So whatever it is you're doing, whatever your role, whatever your job is in IT, remember it has a security component. And when it comes to public clouds, again, it's economy of scale kind of thing. The major public cloud providers have the resources to devote towards security that no individual private organization is able to compete with. Yes, they are targeted more often, but it's like saying a superpower is targeted more often than a small island nation. The fact of the matter is that is true, but the superpower has a lot more resources to devote to defense, and therefore the impact of those attacks is actually probably much less than the attacks on that smaller island nation. So it is with our IT security. So moving forward, now let's talk about the reality that most of us live in. And that is that we don't have a choice between a private cloud or a public cloud. We don't do, rip and shift deployments where we rip everything out of a private cloud and move to a public cloud or vice versa. We live in the reality of hybrid clouds. And this is where we have some private cloud, we have some public cloud, and our role is to make those two talk, to work together, again, to provide value to our organization in a way that seems seamless to our customers, to our user base, right? And the reason that we live in hybrid clouds is it just doesn't make sense for an organization that has been built up for, a year or 10 years or 20 years, whatever the amount of time is, and has installed this entire private cloud infrastructure, private data centers and all that, to just shut all that equipment off, to throw that capital investment away and build it up from scratch in a greenfield public cloud environment. One, the expense is usually too considerable. Two, the downtime, the negative impact to the organization is usually too long. And for three, the number of unforeseens that can happen. the potential for risk is usually well beyond the risk appetite most organizations are willing to take. So a hybrid environment where we move the things that make the most sense, the things that align to our needs and our demands at that time, moving those to the public cloud individually, piece by piece, one after another, however, that's a better fit for most organizations. And one thing that I do a lot with, and I know the speaker in the next session, Dave Kula, he does a lot with, is working with Azure Stack HCI. And so Azure Stack HCI is, of course, when we talk about the HCI part, the hyperconverged infrastructure, that's taking those 3 tiers of compute, storage, and networking and kind of smashing them down into one thing, and allowing them to work, smarter, better, faster kind of approach. But then we build those on Azure technology. So the same technology that is running Azure services up in the cloud is now running up in the public cloud is now running in your private data center. So the things you have to learn to implement, to manage, to optimize, those are consistent between the two of them. So now you don't need to have 2 team members, one focused on how compute, storage, and networking works in your private cloud, and then another that's focused on how that same thing works up in the public cloud. You can have one specialist that really understands where it is and how to use it in both areas. Then that really does go to that point of how you can leverage the technology that was originally designed and is still being designed for the public cloud in your private cloud environment. Data sovereignty. This is an interesting one in that data sovereignty is all about this concept of data being subject to the laws and rules and regulations of the nation where it's collected. That's a challenge in a cloud environment if you think about it, because you might have collected information inside the United States, but maybe you store it using AWS and it's off on a server that's housed in the UK or somewhere else. Well, now how do you enforce the laws of the United States on data that's sitting outside the United States, or vice versa? And a lot of this came into question and really started to be slammed home and brought to us IT professionals after the Snowden revelations and the WikiLeaks and all those kind of things, because it was exposed that the United States wasn't just collecting information from users within its borders, it was collecting it from any source it could. Well, if you think of data sovereignty being that, hey, I'm located in Grand Bahama Island, and you collected my data in the U.S., well, if the Bahamian laws prevent you from doing that, you just broke that law. So data sovereignty is a difficult concept at best, but something that you have to be aware of when you use cloud technology, and particularly in hybrid clouds, because maybe you're collecting the data internal in your private cloud, but then you're storing it up on the public cloud. Maybe that's where your backup repository is, or your cold storage for your backup, whatever. And that public cloud infrastructure spans your nation's borders. Data sovereignty becomes something you have to be aware of. Hybrid clouds, another good reason why we move out of them is, of course, that we can deliver that scaling up that we talked about, the new services, the new infrastructure, platform, whatever it may be that we need to deliver. We can deliver it in record time. There's no ordering, there's no supply chain, which of course right now the global supply chain for just about everything, from milk to nuts as the expression goes, is constrained, okay? And it's impacting everybody. So when you think of a private cloud or a private data center and you have to order things, well, then you have to wait for them to come in. I mean, it doesn't matter how good of an IT person you are. Waiting is waiting. If it isn't there, you can't do anything with it. Whereas the public cloud doesn't present that problem, so you can address those things. And this is one of the reasons why I often talk with folks about, hey, even if you're not using the public cloud, let's get it prepped, let's get it ready, let's get it in a place where you can easily spin up things if you need them. Because if that demand comes along and you say, hey, I just need to order some extra storage for my data center, and then you find out that the lead time is, 6 weeks, that could be a problem. Well, you're already in a place where you could just turn to your public cloud, spin it up, and maybe in the same day or a few days, have it up and ready to go regardless of the supply chain. And of course, one of the things to keep in mind with anything in the cloud is the use of consumable resources. When we buy things as a service, from infrastructure to software as a service, all the consumable costs are built into that pricing structure. So you're not sent a separate bill for the power that the data center is using, the bandwidth that the data center is using, the battery backup systems, the generators, all those things. That's not billed to you separately typically. It's just billed into what they charge you for that particular service. Whereas when you put them in-house, you absolutely have to take those things into account, right? If your generator is sized out at 100 amps and you put in extra equipment that takes it to where the total draw is 120 amp, it's going to kill the generator. The generator isn't going to provide you backup during a power outage, and you got a big problem. So keep that in mind when you're making a decision between whether to house it inside your private cloud or inside your public cloud. It's always what we don't think of that gets us in trouble. As ridiculous as that little saying sounds, I found that to be absolutely true. So when we implement a new server and we don't consider the draw that it will have against our power protection systems, we will find that out soon enough the next time we have a power outage. And it will be a very uncomfortable learning experience. So try and account for those things during your initial design and architecting phase where you're deciding, hey, where am I going to put this and what am I going to do? So now let's kind of look at the good, the bad, and the ugly part in specific silos here. So let's talk about some of the good items, right? One of my most obvious things to talk about here is the fact that you already have an investment in your organization. You've already bought some computing resources. And when you use a hybrid cloud rather than a rip and shift, you're able to leverage those resources, okay, and take advantage of their value to ride them out over their lifespan. And what the hybrid cloud approach does is it allows you then, every time something comes forward, like I was just mentioning, where you need more resources, you can create an architecture or design that doesn't limit you into making an investment in a bigger generator or things like that, right? You could look at that design and say, hey, I need to add X amount of compute because I really want to do a bunch of strong data analysis as part of our procedures, and I need more compute power to do it, right? Now you're not limited to the decision of, okay, well, I got to go make a capital investment in a server, and I've got that. I got to make an investment in storage, and okay, I'm going to make that. Well, this is going to put me over my power budget, so now I got to increase my UPS size and my generator size and all those things. And you're like, well, this data analysis is going to bring me back a value of we'll say, $100, but it's going to cost me $1,000. Well, that doesn't make sense. But now you have the flexibility of considering the public cloud where you don't have to look at those hard investments in compute, storage, networking, where you don't have to worry about the power bill. And all of a sudden, yes, you're still only getting $100 value out of that data analysis, but your cost to implement it is $50. So it's still a net win of $50 for you, and you're like, hey, I'm moving forward with this. So it does allow that leveraging, that flexibility to take place. And let's talk about DR for a minute, right? Disaster recovery. And in conventional disaster recovery, we always talk about our concept of, hey, when a disaster happens, how prepared am I? Do I have a hot site where everything is up to the minute duplicated, not just from a data standpoint, but from office space and workspace and lighting and water and restrooms and all those kind of things? Do I have a warm site, which is maybe I've set up a lease for an area, but the power isn't turned on and the office equipment isn't in there. So in the event of a disaster, I would have to spend some time getting those things spun up and shifted around. Or do I have a cold site where really I have, the data stored off site, so my data is protected, but I don't really have anything as far as where I'm going to spin that up and get people back to work, right? Well, the public cloud gives us this great capability, this such a unique capability of being able to pretty much have a hot site at all times. And a lot of people, when I say that, they go, John, what do you mean? There's no work centers, there's no chairs and desks in the cloud. And I'm like, no, but the cloud is available from anywhere. So those chairs and desks that are at your employee's house, right? Or those chairs and desks that are at your employee's in-law's house or the public library or the Starbucks down the street. Well, those, when you combine them with attachment to the public cloud, become essentially a hot site because you can spin up in the disaster event, you can spin up the workload in the public cloud, connect to it from those places, and be back up and operational in very short order. Shorter order than most companies have ever been able to experience because only the largest organizations historically have ever really been able to afford having a true hot site. And unfortunately, with tomorrow being the anniversary of one of the worst events in the U.S. history, 9/11. 9/11 did teach us some things when it comes to this specific instance. A number of the organizations did have hot sites. The unfortunate thing was those hot sites were only a block or two away. Well, the damage was bigger than that. So many organizations had both their primary data center and their hot site wiped out by the same event, right? And so we learned, one, that there has to be enough physical distance between sites to prevent the same catastrophe, whether it be a man-made catastrophe or a natural catastrophe, from affecting both areas. But then the public cloud came along and said, hey, the public cloud is so distributed and so vast and so broad, it's almost always protected from being impacted by the same event, the same disaster that's affecting a singular area. So it gave everybody an answer to that problem. And for those of us in IT, it made it a lot easier for us to deal with how do we get our organization back up and running with the least amount of loss when a disaster occurs. And it doesn't have to just be DR. Use it for anything. So you have a database that's performing well enough, but all of a sudden for a month and a half, you've got a special project, and it's really going to kind of crush that database server. And it doesn't have enough compute resources to make it perform well for the users that you're going to have over the next month and a half. But you don't really want to go out and buy a brand new server because after a month and a half, it goes back to what it is today, which is working fine. Well, you can transfer that workload up into things like SQL Azure, or even a server that you provision as part of like platform as a service, whichever way you want to do it. But you can move it up there. You can scale it out so it supports the extra demand for a month and a half. And then when you're all said and done that, you can bring that workload back into your private cloud Okay, so now you're not paying that monthly cost up to Azure or whatnot. And you, as the IT professional, are now what you really are, which is the IT hero. You delivered the greatest value to your customers, your users, your organization with the least amount of cost, with the least amount of negative impact. And that's why everybody out there, I really do believe you are not just IT pros, you are IT heroes, because that's what you do for your organization each and every day. Now, some more items that flow into our discussion of the good areas of hybrid cloud. Okay, one thing that's very important are the pre-configured security baselines or configurations, the blueprints that are out there. Most of us have to comply with either some external regulation, whether it be HIPAA or HITECH, any of that, or internal obligation. So we're a privately held company and we're not in healthcare. We still have things, auditors that we have to answer to, shareholders, stakeholders, that kind of thing. And most of them in the current day and age are going to require us to have configurations that are compliant with best practices. Those things published by NIST in the 800 series documents or CISA, those organizations that are putting things out there, we're going to be expected to comply with them. And putting those in our private cloud infrastructure can be difficult because we've got to do them kind of piece by piece by piece by piece. Whereas in the public cloud, we're able to transfer workloads there and then apply these pre-configured blueprints to kind of wrap them up and to make them, if not instantly, quickly compliant with those security standards. And a big part of that security discussion is going to be both identity management and patching updates, those kind of things. And again, in that cloud infrastructure, and these things apply both at the public cloud, and you can even get them down into the private cloud with things like Azure Stack and that sort, but they're important nonetheless. So privileged identity management, Azure PIM is one of my favorite cloud-based security technologies right now because it helps every organization answer the questions surrounding, who has access to what, when does it change, why was it changed, what changed about it, and all those kind of things. Well, most organizations don't have somebody that can monitor that all the time. So Azure PIM monitors it for you. And if someone all of a sudden is given access to a different part of your public cloud tenant, you get an alert, you get a report, you get notified immediately so you can be proactive rather than reactive when you get an auditor down the line that says, why did this happen? And now it's 2 months later and you're forced not only to answer why it happened, you're forced to answer why didn't you know about it for 2 months, right? Because lack of knowledge, in my experience, is never a viable defense against why something happened. And when it comes to security, right? It's kind of that not knowing the law is no excuse for complying with the law kind of thing. So Azure PIM and other solutions related to identity management really do help you out. So take advantage of them. And they're built into a lot of the licenses many of you probably already have anyways. And then when it comes to patching, firmware updates, all that sort of thing, maintenance, maybe it's applying security baselines, that sort of thing, those can be automated through workflows that allow you to spend minutes and hours on the task at hand rather than hours, days, and weeks. So now we covered the good stuff first. Now let's talk about some of the bad stuff. With the bad stuff, even though I mentioned as part of the good, and I know everybody's going to be like, oh, look, he's contradicting himself. Well, that has been known to happen, but in this case, I have a reason. workloads can't always float from on-prem to the public cloud. You may not have the appropriate architecture design to allow that seamless transition to occur without actually creating a whole lot of pain for yourself and for your users. So you need to take that into account. You need to make sure that if you're going to float that SQL database up into the cloud, run it for a while, and then bring it back, that your architecture supports the movement of that data and getting it there and getting it back and having users connect to it and all those things, right? Maybe the application that's actually accessing the SQL backend doesn't work very well when pointing it to a cloud resource versus an internal resource. It could be any number of reasons, but that can be a real bummer when you think you have a solution leveraging your hybrid cloud scenario, and then all of a sudden you can't use it because of something like that. You do have to control things. Change management is important now, or more important now than ever, because when you have resources that are located in many different places and cross knowledge boundaries, right? Cross the boundary of, hey, I'm a Windows Server 2016 guru, but now I'm moving it up into Azure, software as a service. So I need to not so much worry about the underlying OS supporting my application, but just how I can run my application, that sort of thing. It can be very different. I guess a better example would be you're an on-prem SQL Server expert, but then you decide to use SQL Azure. The operational procedures are not identical between the two. There is some difference between them, and you have to be aware of those. You have to document them. You have to control them, and you have to make sure that you train for them. Your team has to be aware. And, keeping your team agile, we could do a whole summit on that, because that is the new paradigm right now that perplexes a lot of IT executives is, how do I create an IT team where its members are agile and flexible and can transition from one technology to a next, versus the conventional IT team, which is I hired people with knowledge in a specific area, and then I leverage that area along with other people with knowledge in other areas. That's a real challenge, because the knowledge required is changing faster than it ever did before. So that person that has knowledge in a specific silo, it remains valuable for less time than it ever did before. It's important. We've talked a bit about DR, which, of course, backup and restore is a big part of DR. Replication is another strategy towards DR. But at the end of the day, I want you to consider that a critical workload, something that is do or die important inside your private data center, your private cloud, is also do or die critically important when you run it in the cloud. Simply moving it to the cloud didn't change its importance at all. So its importance and how you back it up and how you treat it don't change. Okay, they don't change. So keep that in mind. And then the other thing is I mentioned earlier, hey, it's a great feature that we can restore up into the cloud and get people up and going, and that's kind of our hot site now and all this and everything else. Well, if you have huge workloads and itty-bitty bandwidth, you're going to be in a real precarious situation, because you don't readily have that capability. So keep that in mind. A few other things, and these are big ones. I am a huge fan, as I told you about, and I work a lot with specifically Azure Stack HCI, which is a specific implementation of hyper-converged infrastructure. But a lot of people are like, hey, this is great. We've condensed our compute storage and networking all into one. It's easier, it's faster, it's better, it's all those things. Well, not necessarily. It is a lot of those things. But one thing it may not be is administratively easier to maintain because you may have to go through extra steps that are necessary to be able to do things as simple as patching or applying Windows updates or those kind of things. Because while the HCI, particularly if you implement it in a highly available manner or redundant manner, gives you the capability to shift workloads amongst nodes and that sort of thing and do all that, you do have to take some extra administrative steps to make sure that that happens without corrupting things, without breaking things, without doing any of that. And unfortunately, where I see a lot of people run into problems is when they have a GUI that looks really great, right? Like let's talk about Failover Cluster Manager in Windows. And they go in there and they say, oh, I can right-click, I can click this, I can click this, I can click this, and we're in great shape. Unfortunately, there's a lot of variables that the next finish approach doesn't account for. And when it goes south and you're not prepared for it to go south, you can end up in a really horrible dynamic. So, we talked earlier about workflows and things like that automate it, and that's great, and those are definitely advantages. Make sure that you take the time to learn about what the automation is specifically doing, so when it does happen to go south, you know exactly which part of it didn't work right, and you can address that part. Because when you don't understand it and you just say, hey, my patching automation failed, that extends the time it's going to take you to figure out what's going on, because now you actually have to reverse engineer what it's doing and figure out which part was broken. And you should have done that reverse engineering kind of long before. And one thing that I will tell you about HCI is that when you're in a scenario where you have to fix it and say it's housing 100 of your servers, you can't just Google, use Dr. Google, find a couple articles, click, next, finish, and it doesn't work and you just made it worse. That kind of troubleshooting approach is very, very dangerous. So you are way better to gain the knowledge you need on the front end to manage these kind of things. Take it from me. I've experienced a good deal of pain around this particular area, and sometimes pain is the best educator. So now that is a great segue into the worst part of this, the ugly, right? And we get into some of these, and since I was just talking about the knowledge one, I'll start out with the lack of trained and qualified support staff. This isn't just internally. It can sometimes be externally. I'm not going to call out any specific vendors or anything like that, but I'm going to tell you that not all vendors are created equal. And when you choose an HCI vendor, for instance, for your internal equipment, make sure you're choosing one that, one, supports you 24/7, two, supports not only the hardware you're choosing, but the software workloads you're going to put on top of it, okay? And I'm not talking about the ERP software and the SQL software, whatever, but I'm talking about the Azure Stack HCI software or that sort of thing. They need to be able to, at bare minimum, interface, in that particular example, with say, Microsoft to find you a solution. Because it's bad when you're guessing at what to do to fix a problem. It's way worse when your partner is guessing at what to do to fix the problem. So make sure that you choose a partner that aligns with having well qualified, highly available, qualified support staff. I will say that with the hybrid cloud, everybody's vision and goals are very different. So there's not a whole lot of clarity there on kind of what things are going to happen, and it's hard enough. Like one of the big challenges that I hear about and that I deal with public cloud technologies is literally the vendors just changing the names of technologies. If you look at the Microsoft 365 security suite, that has changed names like 3 times in the last 3 years. So just keeping track with names can be difficult. I do want to talk about outages. So when you leverage the public cloud, everybody thinks, hey, they don't have any outages. Yeah, they do. And you can look up that data and you can see them. Now, they do tend to be less frequent than private clouds over time when measured over time. But at the end of the day, an outage is an outage, right? And so you need to decide what your outage tolerance is, and make sure that the data shows that whatever it is you're putting up in the cloud as part of your hybrid strategy can live within that time frame. Okay, so we have a couple minutes for questions, and John, I'll throw it to you. What would you like? What question?
Well, let's see here. Yeah, we just have a few minutes for questions. I'm getting an echo here. I think it might be from someone's speaker. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead. We'll just so here's one. One attendee asks, "What do you think the future will hold for hybrid cloud? Are we just the dinosaurs trying to support infrastructure on-prem, or do you think it will be around for a while yet?"
So this is a great one, and one that I can answer quickly, right? Because I know I want to give everybody a little bit of a break before the next great session, which I hope everybody's going to stay around for because it's going to be great. I know Dave has a lot planned for you. So in this one, the hybrid cloud isn't just an interim strategy. And I know opinions vary on that, but I believe, and when you look at the data, it shows it, whether you look at the Industrial Revolution, whether you look at the information revolution, whatever you want to look at, organizations need to remain at the top of their game and as competitive as possible in a fluid landscape. Right, the pandemic's a good example of that I used earlier. The global economy is another big game changer, right? We do things at a global scale instead of a regional scale or national scale anymore. And so the hybrid cloud, the ability to leverage both internal and external resources, isn't just an interim solution. In my mind, that is a long-term strategy on how to remain the most competitive in that fluid environment. So I don't see the hybrid cloud going anywhere in the span of my career, and I'm not that old yet, so it'll be around for a while.
Okay, here's a quick one that I think you might be uniquely qualified to answer very quickly in our last minute. What are suggestions for helping our IT staff get trained up with practical knowledge? I'm a big fan of hands-on learning versus book learning. What are your thoughts?
So this is great. That's a great question. Thank you. One of the best ways is encourage them to take advantage of trial environments, sandbox environments, right? Like, of course, I do a lot of my work in Microsoft Azure, so I'll speak of that one. You can get both demo tenants, and you can get within tenants, you can get sandboxes. So maybe your company already has licensing and everything else. You can spin up sandboxes that allow your staff to restore your actual workloads in there or that kind of thing, and then break stuff and fix stuff and find the reason that stuff works the way it does or those kind of things. So, that's that hands-on learning approach. And one of the strategies that I like to take personally is I like to give my teams challenges, right? So think of, Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego is a show I remember, and some may have no clue what I'm talking about, probably most. But anyways, at the beginning of each show, the goal was to say we're going to give you a bunch of clues, and then at the end, you're trying to find where they are. So I give them a strategy. I say, hey, we're going to need to increase the number of users in our current production database over the course of the next 6 weeks. How are we going to make it happen? And I send them back to prove it out and show me in that tenant in that trial tenant, that sandbox environment, what is going to happen?
It looks like that this was a jam-packed session, so that's really all the time we have for. There's some other questions here, but we will get those to you, John, by email and give you an opportunity to answer those. Thanks, man. It was a great session.
Thank you, John. It was such a blast, and I appreciate everybody hanging out, and I hope everybody had a great time and hangs out for the rest of it, because it's just going to get better and better as we go.
Be sure, everyone, to visit the MVP Days website for pending titles by John and others. All proceeds go to supporting the next generation of IT professionals. We're going to take a short break now, but we'll be back at the top of the hour for the second session, Experts Top 10 Hybrid Cloud Do's and Don'ts, led by Dave Kaula. I knew I was going to get that wrong. Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting, and led by my colleague, David Rammel, who heads up the editorial team at Virtualization and Cloud Review. Many thanks to Mr. John O'Neill Sr. for a great session, and to our sponsor, Rubrik, the Zero Trust Management Company, for making it possible. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsor. Remember, we're giving away a Surface Pro 7 to one lucky attendee at the end of the third session. You must be present to win, so stay tuned. Back in a few.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, and of course our sponsor, Rubrik, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, and I'm here to moderate the second session of our summit called Experts Top 10 Hybrid Cloud Do's and Don'ts. Our speaker for this session is Dave Kaula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting. Dave is a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communications networks within multi-server environments, and he has led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. Dave, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, David. It's an absolute pleasure to be here for this summit. Once again, thanks to Rubrik for sponsoring the event. It's really appreciated that we have these amazing sponsors. And we've got a really fun topic to talk about here today, which is the Experts Top 10 Hybrid Cloud Do's and Don'ts. So I've broken this up into some interesting topic domains here. And let's get started. All right. So number one, hybrid cloud do's is that we always look for the kind of the utopia of trying to manage our infrastructure through a single pane of glass. We've been talking about this for years in the IT industry, that, you know, we want to cut down on the amounts of ancillary tools that are required to manage the solutions. And we've been trying to get to this place of a single pane of glass for absolutely what feels like forever. And depending on the type of hybrid cloud solution that you're looking at for your organization, this may or may not be a reality for you. And the reason that I wanted to put this as kind of our number one do is that, you know, my good friends over at Microsoft have looked into the crystal ball, and they've kind of seen the future in what hybrid cloud is going to be offering. And they've actually come up with a completely separate SKU called Azure Stack HCI that is the really true single pane of glass from Microsoft's perspective. You can now provision workloads directly from our Azure portal, directly to our on-prem infrastructure, as well as our Azure public cloud. And this unified experience, being able to manage this infrastructure, is so important for our infrastructure engineers and administrators and cloud administrators, because now we can actually learn a single set of tooling for looking after this long term. So I have to say that this really isn't necessarily utopia anymore. It is very possible, depending on the solution that you're looking at. And if you're looking at other solutions that are out there, this is kind of the goal that we have to get to, because I've lived in the space of hybrid cloud for probably the better part of the last 10 years. And so I've seen this grow up right from its inception to where we are today. And it can be a very painful process if you have to go troubleshoot something and you're into 5, 6, 7 different tools. So you want to make sure that this is a high priority when you're looking at your hybrid cloud solutions available to you. And definitely want to check out Microsoft's new dedicated SKU for Azure Stack HCI for your hybrids infrastructure, because that's gonna give you some great options. Okay, so the next thing that we have to do when we look at our hybrid cloud journey is we need to make sure that we standardize the processes and procedures that we have for our infrastructure teams, because when we build hybrid cloud infrastructure, the processes that we follow for on-prem infrastructure aren't necessarily going to directly map over to a full public cloud configuration. And if you don't have that fully seamless single pane of glass, you're going to have to map over and kind of merge 2 sets of processes, because your infrastructure team's way of doing things when they go through change control or they have to make configuration changes is going to be potentially different for them. The next thing that we have to look at is, I've given a lot of talks over the last couple of years on disaster recovery, disaster preparedness, ransomware prevention. And this is one that's really important to me, because when we look at the configurations between on-prem hybrid infrastructure and full public cloud and merging those together and having kind of a unified environment through a true hybrid cloud, DR may be slightly different from a cloud perspective. Some of the things that we have to think about versus traditional on-prem infrastructure is that, when we had on-prem infrastructure, we would look at having a co-location facility, and we would fail over all of our workloads over to another center, and we would protect ourselves from geographical events that could potentially happen: fire, flood, tornado, hurricane, ransomware attacks, things like that. Whereas when we're in the cloud, one of the things that we have to look at is that, well, where are we going to actually fail over to? We have this concept called a fault domain, and are we going to fall over to a single fault domain inside of one region? Are we going to be failing over to a second region? Are we going to be failing over to a completely different cloud provider to give us, cloud segmentation? Are we going to be failing over back on-prem? And these are things that we have to think about, is that when we have a DR event, how survivable is this for us? And, how are we going to treat this? Because in a traditional on-prem infrastructure, we're looking at maybe 2 or 3 different avenues for our DR. But when we throw full public cloud into the mix, you could be at 10 plus different options that you have available for you. So my advice to you is to standardize those DR plans that you have and make sure that you've got a clear path moving forward, because you're going to have to make decisions as to which workloads run where and what to do with them if those do go down. The next one is, along that same discussion topic, was the ransomware and cyber protection that you have to have for your infrastructure. The traditional DR plans are not the same as a cyber incident plan. A ransomware attack for your organization is not the same as traditional DR. It's not like you just press a big button and you get yourself out of it. So you want to make sure that you also have a sidecar cyber incident plan available for both your on-prem infrastructure as well as your public cloud infrastructure, and the hybrid glue that bonds those together. Is that how are we going to survive one of those incidents, and what does it look like? And part of that standardization is also testing and validation. We do want to make sure that we validate that those plans are viable for us. And that actually leads into a great segue here about security for your infrastructure. Today's day and age, security has never been more important for our infrastructure. And so I've been talking about this for probably 2 years straight now, about the role of IT administrators, IT engineers, and anyone on our team. This is how it goes. is that our IT security, our SecOps team includes everyone inside of your organization from IT's perspective, as well as all of the users. We all have to be unified and having an understanding as to what this looks like. Primarily, we don't just throw things over the fence anymore, and we don't just say, hey, security team, we've got an incident, go take care of this. No, we have to have a unified effort to securing and locking down this infrastructure through vulnerability assessments, through infrastructure audits, through security audits, pen testing. This has never been more important for you to look after your infrastructure. And when we do this from a hybrid perspective, don't just assume that because something sits in the public cloud that it's more secure than what it is in your on-prem infrastructure. That's not true. You have to secure those workloads the same way that you have to secure your on-prem infrastructure. And you have to look at this cybersecurity initiative organizationally as a whole. And it starts right from the top down from your CISO all the way down to the end users. And this has to be a focus for your organizations that are out there, because taking the security posture of saying, well, it's not going to happen to us. It only happened to the neighbors next door and the next building over, or the sister companies or your business partners. It's never going to happen to us. But that's not the right approach. We have to take a very much so proactive approach, because you don't want to be caught in an unprepared state in regards to cybersecurity. So from a hybrid cloud perspective, make sure that security is a very, very high priority for you, and making sure that both on your on-prem side as well as in the public cloud side, that things are secured and things are buttoned up. If you have to, assign separate roles, hire some staff to look after these, because it's that important to make sure that your security posture is taken care of. All right, changing gears a little bit from security. When we look at hybrid cloud solutions, one of the interesting discussions that I have, because I've worked in application support with application support teams going on for 20 plus years now, is, what do we do with those homegrown applications? You look at your application stack that you have inside of your infrastructure. One of my customers that I have from a laboratory information management system, LIMS system, that was built from the ground up using Power Builder, and then it was converted over to .NET, still back-ended by Oracle databases. And how well is that three-tier infrastructure, that three-tier application infrastructure with our app servers, web servers, database servers, how easily is that going to be to port that infrastructure over to a public cloud? We're running that hybrid, we're running that on-prem. Maybe we're passing pieces through the public cloud. Maybe we're using some traffic shaping through the public cloud to get to that infrastructure, but maybe the goal is that eventually we want to push that up into the cloud. How easy is that going to be for us to manage that? And so some of the questions that we have to look at along the lines of application support is that even supported by the vendors that we're using? So the developers of that solution or your homegrown application vendors, do they even support or know how to look after that? So we have to look at how easily that is customizable and how well it's going to be supported. And maybe that's the time to start looking at potentially having a brand new application that's a cloud native application that was built for the cloud. That might be the right solution. But any of you that are on the call today that have had to deal with your ERP solutions, it is not just a magic pill that you swallow to shift everything over to a new vendor, new solution, new technology. These are probably some of the biggest projects that we face in IT, is shifting over some of those core workloads and deciding what to do with them. And so when you're looking at these solutions and you're looking at, potentially shifting them around between your on-prem infrastructure, shifting them up to the public cloud, or maybe just running pieces of them in the public cloud, just make sure that you've actually got vendor support for that, So you're not going to find yourself in a situation where you're boxed into a corner because you pick up the phone and you phone the 1-800 support line and they say, well, actually, we're not certified for that particular operating system. And I know we're on a virtual session right now, but I'd love to do this virtual show of hands. How many of you have wanted to go through operating system upgrades and have had the situation where the vendor says, well, we're only supporting that platform for Server 2008, and we might be upgrading that to, Server 2016 support. Well, today we're moving into Server 2022. Why can't you modernize that? Well, that's out of our control from an IT perspective. So however much we might want to modernize all of our infrastructure, these are some of the pieces that really hamstring us from an infrastructure perspective, because like I said, it's not easy to just flip those over. So make sure you do your due diligence and make sure you check with your applications, because our job as IT pros, cloud administrators, engineers, is to make sure that we support the applications that drive and run core critical business functions. And so we have to find a way to put that inside of infrastructure that will work accordingly. All right. So a couple more pieces along that line is investigate your integration options for those applications. And some of the big ones that I'm looking at right now is that some of our customers right now for their on-prem infrastructure, their hybrid cloud infrastructure that they're running on-prem, is they've gone through a cybersecurity audit. And one of the things that I've seen coming through a lot of cybersecurity audits is enforcing multi-factor authentication for entry points coming into the network. And so that could be coming through your VPN. That could be a web-facing portion, an internet-facing portion of that application. That could be critical ERP or accounting applications. That multi-factor discussion is coming up more and more. And this could be an interesting integration point for your public cloud providers coming back down to your on-prem infrastructure, is that, maybe we look at some single sign-on support. Maybe we integrate that with Azure AD. Maybe we use multi-factor authentication cloud-based, or look at some type of passwordless solution for that hybrid application that maybe can never move to the cloud because it just can't go there. Maybe it's not supported. And so when we look at this is a big piece to start evaluating, is that we may have to be forced into a situation from a compliance perspective to start bolting on additional security features to these applications. Make sure that those applications are going to fully support that as well. All right. So now this is a quite interesting one for me, is that trying out add-on features that are available for you. So what exactly do I mean by that? Okay. Well, in traditional infrastructure that would live in our on-prem data centers, we would have certain components that would be inside of those racks that we would support. We would have top-of-rack switches. We would have load balancers. We would have hypervisors. We would have some storage inside of there. And we would use all of that infrastructure and glue it all together in kind of one package, so that we could take and we could support those critical line of business applications. Well, one of the things that we can look at is that, to get things like global load balancing going, getting traffic manager failovers between multi-site, multi-region, controlling traffic, saying that, well, if I've got traffic coming from the West Coast, I want it to be coming in through the West Coast data centers. And if it's traffic coming in through the East Coast, I want it to be coming in through the East Coast data centers. Well, one interesting project that I've been working on, where we've been using some of these bolt-on features from a hybrid cloud perspective, is looking at features, and I'm a Microsoft person through and through, so my references are towards Microsoft and Azure-based technology. So when we kind of looked at this particular project, we wanted to have the ability for this organization who was converting from direct access for a VPN solution to Microsoft's new always-on VPN configuration on-prem. We wanted to be able to control DR failover between those sites. So what we did is we actually used Azure Traffic Manager as the control source for that to determine when we were going to fail over for the VPN between the primary site and the DR site. And so this was giving us a great deal of flexibility, and it's a great example of looking at some of these new add-on features. There's new features that get added every day into your public cloud providers that are out there. So make sure that you look at these, because the traditional approach of going and buying physical load balancers and slapping them into your racks and having, two at the primary site, having two at the DR site, that may not be required anymore. So your journey into hybrid cloud and using a kind of commingled solution might start with something as simple as that, because from a network and routing perspective, that just might make all kinds of sense. The other pieces is that, when we look at, connecting from our on-prem infrastructure to our public cloud, you don't necessarily need to go with the traditional VPN. You can look at a full MPLS-based express route. Maybe you want a 1 gig or 10 gig plus connection to your regional Azure data centers that are up there. These are all possibilities now. And so if you're a larger organization and you're spending the money on an MPLS network that telcos are managing for you, this might just make all kinds of sense, because now this just becomes an extension and another arm. It just basically becomes another co-location facility for you that you can control routing and traffic and really use and leverage that infrastructure more. So that was kind of the point that I was getting at here. Was just there's so many features that are up there. My example is simply just based on the networking piece, but there's just too many to talk about. But you do want to make sure that you evaluate those features, because that can really modernize your infrastructure in a hurry. And you can get some really big, quick wins by looking at that type of infrastructure add-ons. Okay, the next one. There are so many great features that we can bring. And we'll go back to that example of saying, okay, we are an organization. We have an existing MPLS network right now that's connecting all of our sites. Maybe we've got 20 sites spread all across the country, or maybe across multiple countries. And telco's taking care of some of those pieces for us. And we've connected our express route for Azure into that primary network. So we've got great routes. We've got great connectivity speeds coming in there. Well, what are some of the pieces that we can leverage that are cloud-based coming back to our on-prem infrastructure? Because for your public cloud infrastructure, there's just some givens that are there. Machine learning is that's part of public cloud. Threat hunting, security, and AI-based discovery. Those pieces are there. And so the real question is can I take those best-of-breed security and threat protection solutions, and can I port those back to my on-prem workloads? And so the answer is, yeah, absolutely. There's solutions. Microsoft has their advanced threat protection agents that can actually be loaded up on Windows servers. There's a separate SKU that you can buy specifically for your server infrastructure, as well as your desktops that are running both across a VPN, maybe in your office building. I know we always have the COVID discussion, so I don't know, maybe your organizations haven't gone back to the offices yet. Some are just starting to get back. But blending these solutions of having, the ability to do real-time threat hunting, vulnerability assessments, and having the same solutions that you have public cloud and on-prem really build a beautiful hybrid cloud story for you. Because now we'll go back to that first slide that I had, which was the single pane of glass utopia. That's more than just configurations. This is about all of the additional pieces, the intangibles that we don't always think about behind the scenes. And this is a really big one for me. So if we can protect like this in the public cloud, we darn well better be able to protect like this in our on-prem infrastructure as well. All right, number 8, training the support teams. I know that John was talking a little bit about, training the teams and, what it is that we have to do to get them skilled up and skill ramped. Well, you know what? we're in the IT industry, we should assume the fact that, we are in a continuing education career. And so you need to be prepared that when you're taking this journey and you're looking at hybrid cloud and, looking at all of the different options that are out there, you've basically got to continue to skill ramp on a monthly basis. And so one of the things that I always tell my executives when I work with them and the managers and directors of IT is that don't just assume that your team has the knowledge that they already need, because if they learned that 2 years ago, probably needs to be updated, because there's probably been some pretty big advancements inside of that technology. So make sure that from the top down that the budgets have room to make sure that our support professionals that are out there looking after this have the adequate training and knowledge that's required. I was just on the Microsoft Learn site today, and the number of modules that are up there that are available for cloud-based and Azure-based learning is absolutely incredible. And then Microsoft is really ramped up the certification for anything dealing with cloud. So starting right from, Azure fundamentals all the way up to, maybe you wanted to be a data scientist or something like that. They've got certifications in place for all of that. And I highly, highly recommend that you look at that and encourage your teams to work through those learning modules. The best part is that there's typically some hands-on labs that go with that, so they can get the necessary flight time that they need to support this infrastructure that you're heading down. All right, number 9, make sure that you have your security infrastructure validated. You don't want to just say that, we went through and we implemented technology X and that's good enough. Go through some form of a security audit. If it's something that you want to do yourself through some red teaming and blue teaming exercises where you're actually testing your defenses, hey, that's fine. If you're going to go through a formal cyber audit, I highly recommend this, because you only know what you know. And, I've been in this industry a long time, and every time we go through one of these audits, I'm learning new things. I'm learning new ways to defend and protect. And so when you look at this, you want to make sure that that infrastructure, both on-prem and in the public cloud, are both secured. You want to take and review those findings, and don't just let that report sit on a desk somewhere. Be proactive with that. As you're going through your vulnerability assessments that come as part of the security audits, make sure that you're adapting to that. And one of the biggest pieces of advice that I have for organizations today is don't just leave your security audit to something that's a yearly thing that you go through or every couple of years. Consider putting in some real-time vulnerability assessment solutions that will tell you on the fly what's wrong with the infrastructure, because Microsoft puts out notifications and bulletins on almost a daily basis on vulnerabilities that are coming through, and we have to be adaptive as IT and SecOps teams to make sure that we're looking after that infrastructure accordingly. And coming back and fixing all of the holes in your infrastructure a year later, somebody's probably been in and out of your infrastructure many times via those holes, those 0 days, those vulnerabilities. So your cyber audit is more than just that yearly thing now. This is something that we have to have as an ongoing piece of our infrastructure. And so when we look at those critical vulnerabilities and assessments, I almost look at it the same as like a Patch Tuesday now. It's almost like a Vulnerability Tuesday that every month we've got to be going through and closing these holes as they come up. And it requires a lot of diligence from our IT team. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Going through and closing these vulnerabilities as they pop up you're going to break stuff, absolutely. But you have to take a look at the pendulum and say, hey, listen, what's the risk of me not closing this hole versus leaving this gaping wide hole for, threat actors to potentially come into? So be adaptive and make sure that, you're changing the way that we look at this, and in both sides of the equation, your on-prem and public cloud infrastructure. All right. The last one is, and I don't know why this one is with a lot of the organizations that I deal with. I'm still finding that, we try to ask Dr. Google for answers that are out there before we actually ask the vendors for help. And so understand this, is that when you have an Office 365 subscription, when you have an Azure subscription, typically you're going to have some type of a support plan that's dialed into that. Maybe you even have a premier support contract if you're a larger organization. Don't be scared to just ask those questions, because if you run into problems with your infrastructure on either side, on-prem or in the cloud, don't be scared to cut that ticket with the vendor. And so normally if it's a critical situation, and I've been involved in critical situations my entire IT career, and so this is the way that I normally map things out, is that if we're in a server down critical situation, we've lost access to a portion of users or all users, one of the very first things I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the ticket with the associated vendors. So, if it's a joint vendor initiative where we've got, maybe we've got a Cisco involved, maybe we've got a Microsoft involved, maybe we've got a hardware vendor involved, I'm going to get somebody on my team to take and to start cutting those tickets and say, hey, listen, we're going to get them involved, and they can at least start running some diagnostics, and, they can start working on some things in behind the scenes as we're looking to bring the solutions back online. And how it typically works is that if we don't actually have to use that ticket, because we fixed the problem before it actually got to the point where they got back to us within whatever the SLA was, 2, 4, 8, whatever hours it is, then there's no cost for that. You just close the ticket. No harm, no foul. And, just understand that there is help that's out there for you. There's dedicated 24/7 support teams with all of these vendors. You're not on your own with this. And, maybe it's a learning opportunity as well. Maybe it's the ability to take and to learn something new. And, I'm humble enough over the course of my IT career that when I get involved in one of these and I see the organization kind of fumbling through this, the outage is persisting into 8, 16, 20 hours. That's typically the time when I'll get called in. And then the first thing I'll ask is like, hey guys, have we cut a ticket with the vendors? And if the answer is no, I'm like, cut a ticket with the vendors. Get the help that you need. Don't be scared. Don't be shy. They're there to help. That's their jobs. Okay? So just remember that support is there and it is available for us. All right. Okay. So now, of all the do's that we had, let's talk about some of the don'ts. So when we look at adoption of cloud-based technologies, one of the biggest problems that we have is knowledge silos. And knowledge silos being, okay, we've got teams that are working specifically on the ERP application, or we've got teams that are working specifically on identity, or we've got the Exchange team that moved over and now supports Office 365. And so when we look at those individual silos, they may want to move slower. They may not want to move at the pace of change that the organization is looking at. So one of the big things is that we have to take and make sure that we take and we're working through the quick wins that we can have. Some application owners might want to move a little faster, so don't get tied up in those parts of the organization that don't want to potentially move forward. Take the quick wins that you have, get the motivation with your technology owners that are out there, and don't let that slow down the progress inside of your organization. Because if you're stuck working with the application owners that say, well, this critical PLC component is only supported on Windows NT4 or Windows XP or whatever it is, a totally not supported platform anymore. We can't do anything about that because this runs our business. Okay, well, maybe we'll silo, we'll fence that off, but there's always other areas of the business that we can focus on. Don't let those pieces slow down your progress, right? Okay, the next one. You can't treat the public cloud the same as the private cloud. The amount of changes that go into the public cloud versus your hybrid on-prem infrastructure, if we look at the rate of change inside of that infrastructure in a comparison, it's not even close. You know, like thousands of features getting added every single year into the public cloud. And typically when we have some type of a hybrid cloud solution, we have to sometimes wait for those features to get back-ported to our on-prem infrastructure. So the rate of change that we have from a public cloud perspective is far greater than what we have on-prem. And so each side has their own benefits and drawbacks, and there's many different features on either side. But what we have to do is we have to take the approach of using the features that are available for us, and we have to make sure that we really stay in touch and in tune with what the roadmap is driving, because that's going to tell us when and how we're going to be able to use some of these features, because some new whiz-bang feature might come out inside of our favorite public cloud provider, and you're thinking to yourself, oh, okay, well, we're going to use this in our hybrid configuration, and I want to use this right now, and we're going through that single pane of glass in the example of Azure Stack HCI, Microsoft solution. Well, it's not exactly the same from a road mapping perspective. That roadmap moves a lot faster in the public cloud because Microsoft's in full control of all of that hardware and all the infrastructure that they deploy to, and they're not in the hybrid side. You know, that's your infrastructure. That's your vendor of choice that you're going to run that infrastructure and all of those workloads on. So, you know, it takes time to kind of backport, and there is a bit of a lag in there. So just be aware of that and don't set false expectations from a project team perspective that you're going to have the same levels of features and functionality that you are in public cloud versus, you know, your private cloud that you're running on-prem. It's going to be something that is quite different. All right. So the next one is don't neglect the operational considerations. And what exactly do I mean by this? In the public cloud and through our utopia, the single pane of glass, you know, there's a lot of next finish that goes on, either from scripting or inside of the UI. And we still need to make sure that we backport that knowledge. And John actually raised a really great point in his session right before me, where he was talking about when you're inside of a cloud infrastructure and you go through this next finish exercise, and you know, a VM magically lights itself up and it magically connects to the network. You still have to have an underpinning knowledge as to what exactly is going on inside of there. Just because it's easy through a UI doesn't mean you shouldn't still learn the underlying operational portions of that. For example, you're pinning up a network adapter. Well, what type of DHCP scope did that come from? Well, I don't know. It's just on a VNet. It's configured somewhere. Okay, well, how many IP addresses are available in there? Well, I don't know. I just turn on VMs and they just work. Oh, that's not really a viable answer for us. Does it work? Yeah, it'll work. And how long will it work? Well, it'll work until it doesn't, until you run out of IP addresses because you're not planning that properly. And so when we look at this, don't forget that big piece of understanding those underlying components of, you know, what drives your cloud, how was it built, what are the architectural specifications for this, you know, how deep can it go, how fast can it go, and how long can it run for our organization. And so along those lines is that when we're moving into this hybrid configuration where we want to have workloads running in both sides, both on the left and on the right, we want to make sure that we update those operational guides for, our daily, weekly, monthly tasks to have considerations of both sides, because maybe we're running 50 workloads on-prem and maybe we're running 200 in the cloud. Well, the operational considerations for the cloud ones are going to be slightly different for the operational considerations for the on-prem. And, we want to make sure that all of that infrastructure is still being looked after appropriately with our teams. Okay, the next one here is really interesting for me because I actually went through a project with one of my customers. It would have been about 3.5 years ago. They were working on a project that they had codenamed Project Zero Data Center. And so this was a larger organization, multinational organization, data centers in, I think, 3 or 4 different continents all over the world. And they had decided that they were going to get out of the data center business. They were going to get out of the hosting their infrastructure business on-prem. They wanted to move everything up to the cloud, and they wanted to get every single workload that they had migrated over there, and that favorite cloud provider of the time was the choice. And we wanted to get everything up there. And as it turns out, that going through Project Zero Data Centers, one of the things that we discovered was that not all workloads can be run in the cloud. And so, for example, this particular organization ran plant networks. And so the plant networks that they ran, they would basically drive the PLCs for the infrastructure. They would open and close valves and, monitor infrastructure, critical safety infrastructure. And one of the big issues that they had was with a lack of internet or network connectivity, that plant still needed to run in a siloed manner. Like, it needed to basically run completely offline. And so that was just impossible for us to just move that up to the cloud and guarantee that we would have 100% network connectivity all the time. It's not a reality. So just remember that some of your workloads need to stay on-prem. Don't get caught chasing the unicorn of moving all of those workloads up to the cloud. Just put them in the right place. Go through an analysis of those workloads and say, okay, where are these better suited? Are these better suited cloud-based, or are these better suited on-prem? What can our support teams look after? And just that acceptance of where those workloads really belong through that analysis is what needs to go on with this. And I just find that we get into a situation where we're trying to take and push so far in one direction that we have the blinders on. And, I've seen organizations try to do this, and then they just have a separate project after Project Zero Data Center is done called Project Put Them Back Where They Were. and that's the way that it goes. So don't get caught in that trap of chasing that 100% one side. In my belief, hybrid's here to stay. It's just certain workloads are just going to remain on-prem. And if you have an organization where you can go 100% cloud, that's great too. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just really analyze those workloads and make sure that, you're getting those in the right place kind of at the right time. Okay, so now as we start to move those workloads over, we'll go back to that conversation around Project Zero Data Center. This particular organization had a massive SAP deployment. Like, we were talking probably 150 servers that were involved to support the SAP infrastructure across their dev, their test, their pre-production and production environments. And you can imagine how difficult that was to try to scale that and move that over. Well, I had another 400 to 500 other workloads that were kind of, easy targets for us to move over, especially things like static web servers. We got static web servers. We can make some decisions around those static web servers to, adopt some modern technology. Maybe we're going to containerize those. Maybe we're going to take and we're going to move those over to a PaaS solution. Maybe we're going to take and move those over to, something that's a little more cloud friendly for us. Or maybe we're just going to move those VMs straight across and run the web servers on our own up in the cloud. And so start with the smaller, quick wins. One of the things that I find is that when we're working on moving those workloads across in that hybrid configuration, maybe some pieces are going to stay on-prem forever. Maybe you're looking at just kind of moving everything over. But those quick wins for our operational team gives them the required flight time that they have to manage the new portals, new UIs, new infrastructure, new cloud shells, new PowerShell modules that are required, without having to start with the absolute biggest monster applications that we have in the infrastructure. Then once your team gets a bit of confidence with moving some of the smaller stuff, now we can have a sidecar project that has us moving some of the larger applications over. And in the example of SAP actually has solutions that are driven with Microsoft up in the cloud right now to help with this, right? So once again, don't be scared to get your vendors involved to see what's available from a solutioning perspective, because maybe there's a newer, better way of doing this as we proceed on this journey. All right, next one, along the lines of the last one. You're all following in line nicely. Don't reinvent the wheel. Many, many, many cloud-based projects that I've worked on in the last 3 to 4 years, I've had organizations being forced to go through standards. And so they might have to be something driven with healthcare, and so they might have to conform to some type of HIPAA standards or NIST or any of the other standards that are out there, the ISO standards, whatever they happen to be. Interestingly enough, a lot of the public cloud vendors that are out there have published blueprints and templates for your tenant that you're going to build. And so instead of starting with kind of fresh tenant where you have to go and lock all of these pieces down, you really want to consider taking a look at some of these blueprints, because instead of you trying to, chase the project for the next 3 to 4 years securing this, you might be able to actually start in a secured environment right out of the gate. And if you can do that, now all of a sudden you're passing audits, and this may actually be a big driver for you to get a bunch of your infrastructure into your cloud tenant, because that is maybe a little bit more secured infrastructure than what you've got on-prem, because the way that you're going to lock that down on-prem is probably going to be a little different than what you're looking at from a cloud perspective. And you can get to that, security and compliance goal that you have a lot faster. And you'll appease the CISO and the SecOps teams a lot faster by taking and getting there. So just consider that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And even if you don't want to use those templates, you can still review those templates and see all the changes that they're suggesting being made. And then you can kind of work your way through that on a manual basis. And the best part is you can probably backport a lot of that over to your on-prem infrastructure as well, having everything match up quite nicely. All right, so after we get to that point, don't go through and recreate those standards like I was saying, or in regards to the Azure blueprints. You want to take and you want to move forward with, your on-prem infrastructure. You can tweak a lot of those policies. You don't necessarily need to reinvent them. One of the best pieces that I've found from a full-on public cloud perspective is the fact that there seems to be a lot better templates and policies available for you right out of the gate. So that's kind of in line with the last topic that we had. So I'm going to try to, we've got a couple of these left, and then we're going to take a few questions here. This is a good one. Your CMDB, change management, change control. This is actually available for you by default in your Azure tenant for your IaaS workloads. So you get change tracking, you get inventory, you get desired state configuration management, things like auto shutdown, backup, DR, patching support. All of that is actually available by default on those workloads inside of your Azure portal. So that's pretty cool. And those pieces are a huge part of enterprise infrastructure, being able to track them. And so those agents are there, they're available. You just basically have to turn them on. So don't forget to check those out, because inside of that infrastructure, you get a lot of features that are available to you inside of that full public cloud that you may not even be aware of. All right, the next one. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'll just reinforce this. Don't assume that just because you spin up a VM in the cloud and an IaaS configuration, that it is more secure than what you got in your on-prem infrastructure. All of that infrastructure needs to be secured the exact same way that you would for your on-prem infrastructure. If you're locking it down with some type of group policies, if they're Windows servers, make sure that those group policies are extending to your Azure tenant, that you're locking them down there as well, because Microsoft's going to give you some vulnerability assessments on the VM and the core critical infrastructure, but you want to make sure that any of those policies that you have that were coming from on-prem are also extending up to the cloud as well, because you do not want to just spin those up, light them up onto the internet public facing, because that may actually have a route back into your on-prem infrastructure. And there have been many, many cases where the threat actors have actually targeted VMs that are running in an unsecured fashion in an Azure tenant, gained access to them, and then pop their way back over into the on-prem infrastructure as kind of a jump box. So make sure that you secure those public cloud workloads the same way that you would on-prem, and go through your typical secure, validate, and testing methodology. Do not forget about that. And the last one is, this one's really fun, is don't forget to get your cloud certification. This is a great one for all of our IT professionals that are out there that are always looking to maybe get a little bit of a pay bump and things like that. Cloud-based certifications are some of the highest paying certifications in the industry right now. And from Microsoft's perspective, you can start right from Azure Fundamentals all the way up to a solution architect. If you're a developer, they've got developer solutions, certifications like Developer Associates, and even specifically something along the lines of, maybe you're a virtual desktop specialist. They have a new Azure Virtual Desktop certification as well. So there's too many to actually list, but just if you've been slow in adopting or you haven't done certifications in a little while, go to Microsoft Learn. There's so many different options available for you there. I'm always a huge fan of expanding your knowledge domains. And I think with that, I will probably turn it over to David. And David, did we have any questions that came in?
We certainly do, Dave. Thanks for that great presentation. And I'd like to remind the audience that we can answer questions until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next presentation. So send them on in. And that's exactly what Vicente did from the audience when you were talking about apps. It was a don't number 4. Identifying on-premises apps versus cloud native and that kind of stuff. And he asked, how to identify those that should be on-premises? Why, instead of premises, not move the workloads to a private cloud?
Well, it's a great question, and it's all determined based on the analysis of your applications, your application owners, the business's appetite to moving those up to the cloud, and the level of modernization that you want to look at. Sometimes in moving those applications up to full-on public cloud, it's not as simple as just swinging them over. There might not just be that one-button migration tool. You might be into some heavy development to get some of those customizations to actually work up there. So the best advice I have is test, test, test. You want to make sure that you see if these applications can even run up there. So in a lot of cases, what I'm asked to do is to see in kind of a evaluation process if that application can even run in the other side. And so if it can, then we know we have options. If it can't, then we kind of start going down with Plan B. But yeah, absolutely great question. Thank you.
Okay, the next question comes from Tom. He asks, are there any resources or tool suggestions that would help to re-architect a current environment?
Oh, I would say that probably start looking at things like the Azure blueprints that I had mentioned. That just has some fantastic information. Like most organizations, we're probably looking to strengthen our security posture and go through and re-architect. There are just so many great resources available, and I've looked through and used those Azure blueprints in the past, and that's a really good starting point.
Okay, looks like we have time for one more question. And it reads, how about modernizing operating systems? Do you think that organizations should move forward with the latest release of Server 2022, Windows Server 2022, in the public cloud prior to on-premises hybrid?
It's a great question, absolutely great question. And one of the things that I've seen Microsoft doing, David, is I've seen Microsoft extending new features into what we'll call the cloud-ready versions of those operating systems. And so one of the big things that they started to do with the workloads that are running in Azure specifically is things like hot patching. So less reboots because the kernel is just aware of those patches. And that's huge for us in the operations team. Those patches during Patch Tuesday just kill us because of all the reboots. And so that stuff's not necessarily backported right away into the on-prem versions of those that we could run in our hybrid cloud. So yeah, I think it's definitely worth looking at. Like anything, the big crux of all of this is always vendor support. Do your vendors support you running your applications on Server 2022? Always a TBD. The vendors are always lagging behind us. So I find that we're always a little bit limited to what our vendors can provide for us. But I like to take the posture of saying, yeah, I want to evaluate probably in the cloud first.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Dave, for a great presentation and answering those questions.
Thanks a lot, David. Great to be here. Thanks, everyone, for attending.